in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast, is we're going to discuss the merits and maybe the limitations of internal and external variables and monitoring them. And what I mean by that are things like heart rate, lactate, ventilation variables, SMO2. Those would all be classified as internal variables. External variables are things like speed and power. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today I'm joined by Dave Schell, founder and head coach of Kaizen Endurance, for another episode of Fast Physiology, where we do a succinct dive into a single endurance topic. In today's episode, we're going to explore the question, what metrics should you be measuring during your training, and is power or speed enough? Enjoy. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Dr. Phil, thanks for having me.
I think we need to start being a little bit more formal and saying David and Philip.
There we go.
And that's,
I like it.
No, absolutely not. We were just talking about that, and it's like because everyone has always called me Phil. Anytime someone calls me Philip, I'm like, that's not me. That just doesn't it just doesn't stick with my name. But I do like Dr. Phil. That is kind of fun. And but I will never be that Dr. Phil. But I think that's okay. I don't know if I want that association. All right. So today, and Dave and I have been kind of talking about this offline a little bit, is we're going to discuss the merits and maybe the limitations of internal and external variables and monitoring them. And what I mean by that are things like heart rate, lactate, ventilation variables, SMO2. Those would all be classified as internal variables. External variables are things like speed and power. Those are the output variables that you have. So Dave, I guess where we can start is, what do you typically recommend for athletes to use when they come to you and start training with you?
Yeah, so I use a combination of things, and I think I probably frustrate a lot of athletes that maybe just start working with me, especially if they haven't had a power meter yet. And so it's like I encourage them to get a power meter, and then they get it, and then I say, okay, now don't look at it. We're just going to collect data for the first 2 to 3 weeks,
Yeah.
And for me, I tell them that the power meter is really about improving our communication, and so it gives us an objective variable to compare with the subjective feedback and stuff like that. And so to answer your question, I use a combination of power, heart rate, and RPE, or rate of perceived exertion.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, I mean, to basically, this is fast physiology, so to answer everybody's question, or to answer this question, I think the optimal way of going about measuring variables or monitoring is to have an internal variable that you're using and an external variable that you're using. So for me, what I personally use is I use SMO2. So that is, if you haven't heard of this, that is near-infrared spectroscopy derived muscle oxygen saturation. So typically it's just a little device that's probably a little bit bigger than this iPhone case that I have, or headphone case that I have. There we go.
AirPods.
And AirPods. There we go. And Apple is not a sponsor yet. And what it does is it shines red light into your muscle and can determine how much oxygen is bound to your red blood cells. So SMO2 is the percent that actually has oxygen still bound to them, and what it can tell us is how your muscle is utilizing oxygen at different exercise intensities. So I like that because it gives me an idea of what's happening locally at the muscle. I like heart rate because that gives me an idea of what is happening at the whole body level. And then I like power output or speed because that is telling me how well your body is integrating those internal stresses and translating them to external stresses. Because at the end of the day, we don't do races based on heart rate It's like, oh, person who, managed the highest heart rate doesn't win.
Right.
Person who managed the lowest SMO2 doesn't win. Person who managed the most steady lactate doesn't win. It's based on who can go the fastest over the distance or have the highest power over the distance. So I like to have both of those because they are giving me a different idea of kind of like what's happening over time.
Yeah, and I heard somebody at one point explain it to me, and this is what I've always used because I liked it, is that power is the work you're doing, and your heart rate, or in this case SMO2, is your body's response to the work you're doing. And so it's kind of a lagging indicator and it's going to change based on external variables. So if it's hotter, if it's colder, if you're dehydrated, things like that, those things could potentially change, whereas the mechanical output should, in theory, always be the same.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is one of the positives to these mechanical or output variables, right, is that they are telling us how much work our body is doing, speed or work. And 200 watts on flat ground is 200 watts going up a hill, is 200 watts going or at the top of a mountain. So you have an idea of what your mechanical output actually is. However, I think then immediately one of the drawbacks to that is that those power outputs, if you're flat uphill at sea level or going uphill to altitude or in hot environments, does not reflect how hard your body is actually working. So this is where, those internal variables come into play, right? Heart rate. Heart rate is going to be higher at 200 watts in the heat versus the cold. Heart rate is going to be higher at 200 watts at altitude versus sea level. And then hill-wise, it might be a little different depending on how good of a flat versus a hill climber you actually are.
Yeah, exactly. It might introduce some inefficiencies or different recruitment patterns, things like that. And so, again, the cost of the work might go up depending on how good you are at climbing. And I think the other thing that we haven't kind of touched on is using max heart rate as an indicator too. And so how do you see that playing into this?
Yeah, so there seems like there's infinite ways to determine your zones and other things like that. And I recently made a post about determining your maximal heart rate because I think a lot of the times, people will just use age-related equations, and then they will, determine their zones based on that. But those age-related equations, if you actually look at like the graphs that make the trend lines in the equations, we have a line, and then we basically have just a smattering of people up and down. So it works on a population basis. The R-squared values are incredibly high, but they do not do a good job on an individual basis. So I don't know if in this realm right now, max heart rate really matters. I think it's more along the lines of, from a zoning perspective, individual heart rate matters more. Right. But what I will say is that if you are trying to measure improvements to performance, you need to have a measure of output. So either a time it takes to finish a distance, that would be like a race, a speed that you can maintain over a certain amount of time, or a power you can maintain over a certain amount of time or for a certain distance. But in order to know that you're actually getting more, say, cardiovascularly fit, you would say, okay, well, I could maintain a power of 300 watts for 30 minutes. And when I initially started, my heart rate at the end of that was 175, something like that. If you came back and you did 300 watts for 30 minutes and then your heart rate was 165, that would be a pretty good indicator that from a cardiovascular perspective, you're actually getting more fit.
Right.
Or you would say on the flip side, okay, well, now I did a 30-minute ride and I hit 350 watts and my heart rate was 175, just like the beginning, but now I've raised my mechanical potential or my mechanical output by that extra 50 watts. So having both of those gives an indication of your performance, and then how your internal stress is actually changing as well. So whenever somebody asks me, because I inevitably get this question all the time, because I am an exercise physiologist, I'm like, yeah, you have to measure your physiology. People are like, well, why? The reason that we want to measure and track our physiology over time is that physiology gives us tells us what roads that we actually travel to get to the better performance. So if you're measuring things like VO2 max, second threshold, and economy, there's multiple different ways you can get to better performance. You can get to better 300 to 350 watts. You could have increased VO2 max. You could have the same VO2 max with increased second threshold, or both VO2 max and second threshold could remain the same and your economy could be getting better. So there's a number of different ways, and different exercise interventions actually target those different variables differently. So that's why I'm a proponent for measuring those internal variables, because I think CrossFit's a perfect example of this. They say the only thing you should be measuring are your times during these benchmark tests that you do repeatedly, and that's a measure of if your performance is getting better. Nothing within that statement was false, but we don't know how you got to those better performances if we don't measure the internal stress and how that internal stress is changing. So if, for example, you could have somebody who just gets really, really strong and then their performance gets better, or they could get more cardiovascularly fit and then their performance gets better. And those represent two very, very different adaptations and what is working for that individual person. And it gives you a better way, especially as a coach, of manipulating the workouts to garner those specific adaptations. So that was a little bit of a rant on why I think physiology is really important, and not just measuring, like those external variables. But I mean, Dave, I'm sure you've seen tons and tons of people use just power output. And what would the argument be for just using, say, power output?
I think one of the arguments would be that it's convenient, and that it's one of the old sayings, and this is something I disagree with now, is when power first started to get popular, a watt is a watt. And yes, if we're speaking in physics, then a watt is a watt. However, with different bike manufacturers and indoor versus outdoor and like all these different variables, a watt isn't a watt. I mean, you've probably heard me harp on this before, where the stated accuracy of a power meter is typically plus minus 2%. Mm-hmm. So to 300 watts, that could be 12 watts, 6 watts either direction. Mm-hmm. And so just with that mechanical variable from day to day, that's one issue. And then the other is that, like you said, it doesn't measure the internal cost of that effort. And so we only have one kind of data point, and we don't have anything to measure it against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I think it's, I think of adaptation and complication of measurement on a continuum, from like the very bottom of that continuum is like someone who has never worked out before, totally sedentary, and just wants to get into exercise. It doesn't really matter what they're measuring. If they're measuring anything, that's going to be better than doing nothing to begin with, and as long as it's informing them on how to train. Because I think that's something too, is like, I think people go to the nth degree to measure all the variables I described earlier: lactate, ventilation, SMO2, heart rate variability as internal variables, and then they measure, power output, torque, like left and right power differences, like the list goes on and on and on, speed, cadence, everything. But then they have all those variables, and then they can't do anything with them, right? Because they're telling slightly different stories. So I just want to caution people on going too far, one direction or another. I think that for the people who are the wellness folks, the people who are just trying to stay healthy, very minimal technology is necessary, and just kind of getting estimates like we were talking about of what's going on and how your performance, both internal and external variables, are changing over time would be great. So speed and heart rate would be really, really nice. But then as you go up in terms of level of competition, seriousness of racing, other things like that, you get to a point where it's like, okay, well, maybe we want to be measuring lactate because we're not sure how many carbohydrates you're actually oxidizing and how your diet is changing how you're oxidizing those carbohydrates. So maybe that's something you want to start to put into account because you want to really hone in on that. But again, if somebody was just using purely mechanical output, I still think they're very limited in terms of they don't know how they got to where they got to, right? Did their lactate values go down? Did their ventilation go down? Did their heart rate go up? What?
And the other argument I'd make here too is that at the beginning of this, you said, the goal of a race is to whoever completes the course the fastest, and you said or highest power, but I would make the argument too. A lot of times it's not the person with the highest power because that means maybe they weren't great. You're putting out a bunch of power, but you weren't very efficient. You're sitting straight up, you're catching wind, you're
Right.
pedaling a lot, doing a lot of work when other people are sitting in and conserving energy. So it's like the ultimate goal of a race is to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And so then I would say the next point is to get there as efficiently as possible. So how can you get there with the least amount of work, and still beat your competitors? And so that's just one more argument for measuring more than one variable. It's like, great. So you have this power, and like I'll use triathlon as an example, or time trial. As you start to work on your aero position and start to work on aerodynamics, you might lose a little bit of power. And so it starts becoming about this balance of CDA versus power output. And you're trying to find the optimal balance there. And so again, you're trying to get like as fast as you can with as little output as possible, or as efficient as possible.
Yeah, that was something when I first started the Critical Oxygen podcast that was really interesting to me, was that almost everybody I talked to in terms of coaches were like, the most important variable for performance is initially economy or efficiency of movement. And that is something that if you then take a step back and look in the research realm, it's highlighted, but it's not something that is quite focused on. Because even though it does make a huge difference, right? If you're sitting up versus more aero, you're immediately going to have better gains in terms of your ability to go faster for less power output.
Right.
And that's kind of what it comes down to, is that balance. And again, if you're not measuring it, though, if you're not measuring oxygen consumption or getting some level of how much heart rate it costs per power output, then you have no idea if you're an efficient individual or if you're inefficient, and how that is changing with different, what would it be, with different, say, bike setups, right? Seat heights, stack heights, positions, other things like that. So I think the bottom line is, and what we're getting at, is that you can't just use speed or power, but on the flip side of things, you can't just use an internal variable, because an internal variable really tells you nothing about how you're actually doing in terms of your performance. So I do like the idea of like zone 2 work being at a certain physiology, because then your body is then dictating the output rather than the output dictating the physiology, in a sense.
Right.
So I think from an easier perspective, physiology is a little bit more important. As you get into the specific side of things, you have to shift more towards those performance variables, because that's what your race is ultimately going to be determined by. But then high intensity stuff, I almost always recommend based off of ranges of power outputs or speeds, because I just think it's easier to quantify from that perspective.
And I'd even make the argument for once I get below an effort, like, I don't know, maybe even 5 minutes. So like 5 minutes or less, I kind of go towards RPE at that point because it can be so influenced by day-to-day like recovery, and especially in power I see it. So like sprint performance and stuff like that. And so rather than giving people a target, it's like, if it's like 90 seconds or less, it's just hard. It's very hard. Is what
Yeah.
we're going for, you know? And it's like whatever feels hard that day. And you might see some variability. So yeah, I agree with that. And then I also think there's a huge benefit in using pace or using power to calibrate people's internal kind of power meter. So comparing
Absolutely.
like, okay, this is how I feel right now. This is what my heart rate's doing. This is what my power output is. Because eventually my hope is that with an athlete, they don't even have to look at their power meter. They know they'll be sitting there riding and they're like, okay, right now I'm at like zone 2. My breathing's starting to like quicken a bit. I feel like I'm working, but it's not terribly hard. I could probably do this for several hours. And then you start to approach threshold and you're like, okay, I'm about to redline. My legs are starting to burn. My breathing's starting to get a little bit more rapid. It's like, I think there's so much value in being able to feel those things so that when the power meter is not working, or in the case of trail running, like if you're doing a lot of workouts on the road and on the track, then all of a sudden you get off road and it's an uneven surface, you're running uphill, like pace is worthless at that point. And so just knowing again how those things feel compared to where you're at in kind of that spectrum.
Yeah. No, I think that would be, in my opinion, the ultimate goal for every athlete that I coach is to get them to do workouts based off of rating of perceived exertion. But one of the challenges with that is that most of the time I find that individuals' calibration is off. And for the most part, it's skewed higher. So whenever they're doing a workout, especially in the beginning, they're like, oh yeah, my RPE was a 5, even though their heart rate and their power output would indicate that they're probably closer to an 8 or a 9. So what I think in an ideal situation, what I would like to do is I want to get somebody used to exercising with heart rate, power at the bare minimum, but then using that to say, okay, well, how does that subjectively feel? And then give them a way of recalibrating their internal or their subjective feeling to what is objectively going on in terms of a mechanical output or in terms of an internal variable. So inevitably, when the heart rate monitor doesn't work or you forget it, or when the power meter doesn't work or just stops working in the middle of a race, you're not just floundering trying to figure out what your pacing is. You're just listening to your body. But I think it's way easier said than done. I think a lot of people are going to spend a lot of time using both of those variables trying to get to that point of, oh, I'm just exercising all based off of RPE, but at the same time, we're still going to want to measure those variables to see how things are changing over time as well. So there's never a point where somebody just like gets rid of all of that, especially in the performance world. But I think that, they could become less reliant on both the internal and external variables, and then just really work off of subjective data, their RPE, how they're feeling. And that would be an ideal scenario.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And the last thing I'll add to that is a lot of times, like, one, I'm always using all those things. Two, a lot of times it gives me an indication when it might be time to retest again. If, like you said, people are saying, oh, it feels easy, the heart rate shows that it's easy, but then the power is what used to be zone 3 or zone 4, which was close to threshold, then it's like, okay, maybe we need to update things, or maybe we don't even test. I just bump things up 10 watts and see how does it feel next time, know? And then also I think it can be really valuable to get in tune with that. And then if you are racing at altitude or you are racing in the heat, how to like intuitively shift everything based on those external variables that are happening that are going to affect your power output, or going to affect the cost of the power output, rather.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. Those people who are kind of unconsciously competent, that's what I would call them, is kind of like Zen master of, like knowing their body. is going to be able to adjust their effort accordingly, whether it's a hot environment, high altitude environment, an environment that's just different from what they normally exercise in. But again, I think that's like Jedi Master status. Whereas I think a lot of people aren't going to reach that. But my biggest takeaway is that you can learn a lot by measuring internal and external variables. Bare minimum, it's got to be heart rate, power, and speed. I like to add SMO2 as an internal variable that is a local variable to know how the working muscle is actually adapting and changing. You're going to monitor those things over time, and then those are going to give you indications of how your physiology is changing and ultimately how that is affecting increases to performance. Dave, do you have anything else you'd like to add to that? What's your big takeaway on these variables?
Yeah, I don't even know if it's a takeaway, but it's something I wanted to add when we were talking about heart rate. I used to, so again, using the age formulas as a way to come up with max heart rate. One, I want to say that I think measuring things based on max heart rate is terrible.
Okay.
Because max heart rate, one, there is not an easy way to figure it out, and two, it's very affected by fatigue. And so what I've seen is that as people have a lot of training load and they're deep into a block, it's harder to get heart rate up, and so it almost gets blunted a bit. When they're really recovered, heart rate gets really responsive, and they're able to get it up. And so using that as a measure typically isn't good. The other thing I want to say, just to kind of add credence to what you were saying about the graph with dots being everywhere, I used to think, okay, like in general, men have lower heart rates, women have higher heart rates. In general, smaller people have higher heart rates, bigger people have slower heart rates. But in my years of coaching, I've seen people that are so outside of that. I've seen an older, 50-year-old man that weighs 200 pounds that is doing his interval work at 175 beats per minute.
Yep.
And then I've seen women that are on the flip side of that. And so I think there are generalizations we can make, but people are individuals. And so you can't you can't just take 220 and minus your age to come up with those zones or targets.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that one in the next Fast Physiology episode. But yeah, I agree. I think that while the max heart rate I don't think is something that we should be putting a lot of credence into. I do think that one of the benefits of measuring heart rate is that it is so responsive. If you are overtrained, maybe it's going to look lower at everything, right? So you might confuse that for, I'm getting more fit. Right. But if your subjective data, your RPE stuff is I feel like absolute garbage. This is like an 8. It used to be a 5, but my heart rate's lower, so I must be getting fitter. It's no. Maybe you're overtraining. So right. That could be something that would be an indicator, early indicator of overtraining potentially as well. But you have to connect all those variables, and you have to be willing to sit down, talk with your coach, think about those sort of things. So those are our fast talk or fast physiology ideas on internal variables. What are your guys' opinions on in terms of what do you use? Heart rate, power? Do you lean more one way than another? Do you use both of them? Comment down below. Shoot Dave and I DMs. You can find me, as always, at Critical02 on Instagram. You can find Dave at Kaizen Endurance. You can also find Dave at on the Training Babble podcast. And this is a continuing series called Fast Physiology, where him and I go back and forth. We record one podcast episode here, then another podcast episode on Training Babble, and we just go back and forth. So go check his podcast out. We got some really cool episodes coming out and some cool episodes that have been published. And as always, we'll catch you guys in the next one.